to winning isn't easy. Let's talk about strokes and Moyamoya disease and an ERISA disability claim. Now, remember, I think that this is applicable regardless of the nature of your disease, but particularly applicable to chronic diseases, progressive diseases, or rare diseases. Moyamoya disease is a rare blood vessel disorder. It will cause blockage of the carotid artery. That in turn is going to block blood flow into the tiny blood vessels that are developed at the base of the brain. And obviously, that's how your body supplies your brain with oxygen and nutrients. Now, the tiny blood vessels that are impacted can result in Moyamoya disease. And Moyamoya is a Japanese term that refers to a hazy puff of smoke or cloud. And that's what the blood vessels will look like on a scan. Similarly, you might have PD, you might have MS. So the disability carrier is going to be looking at those scans to see what they would expect to see that is the basis of the diagnosis. But many times carriers then forget the rest of the picture, if you will. And that's the complications of the disease. Now, in Moyamoya disease, you can have transient ischemic attacks or strokes. Any one of those can result in impairment. So, for example, a stroke can result in visual impairment, can result in cognitive impairment, can result in physical impairment. And it's often the complications of the underlying disease that can result in an ERISA disability claim. So let's take an example of a person who has Moyamoya disease and has a stroke, or a person who has epilepsy and has a stroke complication, or a cardiac disease with a stroke complication. Remember, there are all sorts of complications that can occur with acute medical conditions and chronic conditions. But let's, for the sake of this discussion, talk about stroke complications. So your medical records need to document the diagnosis, be it Moyamoya disease, heart disease, MS, you name it, it should be documented. Then what you have to do is document the stroke, i.e. the complications. It could be because of the stroke, you have visual issues or cognitive issues. So the carrier is going to want to see, as I've said, visual testing, visual acuity testing. They're going to want to see neurocognitive testing. As again, I said, in the case of a stroke, for example, the carrier is going to look for symptoms of weakness, numbness, paralysis, visual problems, trouble speaking, known as aphasia, headaches, involuntary movements, cognitive issues. And it is those complications that are going to win, I think, your disability claim. So I think, and I recommend to my clients, that they give a really good interval history between each visit about their symptoms and their functionality, because you want the doctor to document that. Now, I recently had a case where my client who has cognitive impairment came in with a very, very detailed history, interval history, and the doctor questioned how my cognitively impaired client could write all this down, remember it, do it in such an orderly fashion, and questioned the disability. And of course, we had to explain that it wasn't the client who was keeping this diary. It was the spouse that was keeping this diary. So we have to be careful about these diaries, if you will, these interval histories. We want to be explaining what's going on, but not in so much detail that one questions whether you actually have these complications, whether there's exaggeration, and who's documenting this. So needs to be a nice balance, if you will, because ultimately the physician is going to be relying on your report of your symptoms and complications, their observations, and rendering opinions about your functional restrictions and limitations. Obviously, you're in the case, for example, of a stroke, the doctor is going to be taking an interval history of your symptoms, doing a physical examination, commenting on your restrictions and limitations, commenting on your treatment and your response to treatment. So the medical records shouldn't tell an incomplete history just about symptoms, just about treatment, just about your response to treatment, but should tell a story like a book. chapter by chapter by chapter, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. I know that people tend to answer questions of doctors perhaps glibly, like the doctor says, "How are you doing?" And you say, "You're fine." And the doctor thinks, well, they said they were fine, but what about all these laundry list of problems? So don't be glib about this. Take this very seriously, because well-developed medical records can make all the difference in getting and keeping your ERISA disability benefits. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of Winning Isn't Easy and learned lessons from a Moyamoya claim. And you wonder, why on earth is she talking about that? And have learned today that these kinds of issues that you see in Moyamoya diseases claims arise in all sorts of chronic and progressive medical condition claims. It's the same game, unfortunately, just a different disease. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like this page, leave a review, share it with your family and friends. And of course, subscribe to this podcast. That way you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I look forward to talking with you in next week's episode of Winning Isn't Easy.